So having listened to my recording on questionnaires, which gives a general overview, this recording focuses specifically on questionnaire measuring scales, so that when we want to measure various things like attitudes, motivations, behaviours, we sometimes want to use a kind of scale to try to understand the degree of agreement, for instance, with a particular statement. So there are various different ways that you can do this. So, first of all, one kind of measuring scale is one that is an itemised rating scale. So, for example, you could do this on a scale from 1 to 10, as the example there, rate the venue cleanliness on a scale from 1, which would equal poor, to 10, excellent. And these scales typically operate with between 5 and 10 points on the scales, and numeric scales often work on 10, so 10 out of 10 being good, 1 out of 10 being poor. Something to think about, and this is for all of these kinds of measuring scales, is how do you deal with people who don't know or it's not applicable to them. So for instance, if you were rating the quality of food at a hotel and you hadn't actually eaten any food at the point that you completed the questionnaire, you either don't know or it's not applicable. Okay, so you may need to actually have an extra option for people to indicate that. Otherwise, sometimes, particularly if you're doing a questionnaire online and actually it forces people, or you can choose to force people to answer the question, they actually can't give a legitimate answer. And actually that can sometimes quite annoy people and they will drop out of questionnaires if that's the case. So do think about whether you need a don't know or not applicable option for all of the measuring scales that you use. Then there's another kind of measurement scale, which is referred to as a Likert scale. Now this is based on the work of a psychologist many years ago, and a lot of you will be familiar with the Likert scale. And basically what this does is it's usually used to measure attitudes to various things, and you quite often have a long list of statements that respondents are asked to agree or disagree with, typically on a scale that goes from strongly agree through to strongly disagree, as shown there. And you can then give these a code from say strongly agree as 1 through to 5 being coded strongly agree, and you can actually sum the scores that you get across the items that are measuring the same concept, and give an overall score for a particular concept that you're interested in. So these are very, very common. It's very rare that I see a student designing a questionnaire that doesn't have some statements that people strongly agree to strongly disagree with. Various issues here. If you have a lot of statements, this tends to be when you get these problems. So there are order effects. So if you have one statement positioned before another statement, that can actually have an impact on how people answer the second statement, because they've already given a view. Say they've said they agree with the first statement. When they look at the second statement, they also sort of feel they probably want to agree, but they don't agree as much as the first statement, and therefore they maybe end up ticking neutral. And so, the order that the statements come in can have some influence on people's answers. And sometimes in online questionnaires, you have the option to reorder the statements for different participants, and it will do that automatically, and that can actually reduce those order effects. You also have what's known as acquiescence. So people are filling in a load of attitude questions, and they just begin to kind of go, yeah, I agree, yeah, agree, yeah, probably agree. So you end up with people giving more or less the same answers, and it doesn't necessarily differentiate their views on different concepts and topics that might be covered there. And then there's a central tendency. So people who, perhaps aren't, lots of questions in front of them, they're getting a bit fed up and they just kind of decide to go neutral all the way down. Or they don't vary much, so they're kind of neutral, agree, disagree, in that kind of middle area. And then the final thing, which is, we don't want at all, is pattern answering. And this is where people look at a big load of questions in front of them, can't be bothered, and actually just make a nice pattern on the page. So maybe they're putting crosses in a diagonal. And you do occasionally see this, particularly on paper-based questionnaires, when, your respondents isn't being particularly helpful at all, and they're just not bothering. And sometimes you get this when there's some incentive to complete. So like people who complete the questionnaire get put into a prize draw. and people will sometimes do this. And with some panel surveys, they have a way of screening out these kinds of responses, because obviously it messes up your data set, but you can see that. And I sometimes look for that when I'm entering data and discard any questionnaires that appear to show that. Then there's two more kinds here. So under measuring scales 3, there's a semantic differential scale. And this is where you can have bipolar statements with sort of opposite meanings at either end of a scale. And then people indicate on a scale between those two items where they sit. So, you might have, so it's often been used in brand personality research. So you might talk about a destination, say we'll look at it in terms of countries you might visit as a tourist. So you might have, a number of different countries, and you have to indicate whether you think they're boring or exciting. And you can do it for, as it says there, brands, so Nike, Adidas, different kinds of sports brands. You could do this kind of work with a number of statements. Then the fourth one there is something called a staple scale. So this one, you have a statement on a topic in the middle, and then you have negative numbers on one side and positive numbers on the other, and people indicate that whether they sort of feel positive or negative about that statement on a particular topic. So don't just get stuck with the liquor type scales. There are various other kinds that you can actually use. Some of them can be more relevant particular studies, like the bipolar statements can be particularly useful in certain kinds of marketing research related work. And then under 5 here, I've just mentioned various other things that people use. So for instance, you can use what are called graphic scales. So graphic scales are where, rather than having words and categories like strongly agree, neutral, they actually just have a line, between items. So for instance here, you could rate the hotel food from very good food to very poor food by actually just marking on the line where you feel it sits. And this overcomes actually the sort of subtle meaning implied by words like strongly agree. How much more do I agree with something when I say strongly agree than when I say agree? It's a little bit vague. It's a little bit subjective, whereas this is a little less subjective. If you obviously do this as a paper-based survey, you have to actually go and measure where people have put it, so that's not very helpful. If you have this option online, then actually the system will automatically capture that data. Then there's other kinds of things that people can use, like pictorial scales, so things like smiley faces. These could be helpful if you're doing a questionnaire that involved children. So, that might be a possibility there. Sometimes smiley faces people might think is a bit sort of a bit childish for adults. So, perhaps needs to be used with care. And there are plenty of others, so you can go and explore this further. And obviously, if you're designing a questionnaire, you would want to have a good read of the textbooks on questionnaire design, and you might come up with other options, and also have a look at how other studies in your area have done this.